Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Global Journalism Seminar Series. A very happy new year to you all from a lockdown England. I'm in an attic room above a flooded street, but nonetheless, it's amazing to be back here, and thank you all for joining. We're starting off this term's sessions with one of the most important topics in journalism, which is trust in news, because being blunt, if nobody trusts us as journalists, why do they pay any attention to us? Why do they pay for us? Why is our word valid? These are fundamental questions to the future of journalism. And so I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Benjamin Toff, who's a senior research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. He's the lead researcher in a Trust in News project, a new multi-year project we have that will look into this issue globally, looking at what this means in several different countries, in several different media types. We will stick to the usual format, so Ben will present and then we will have questions open to all. If you have questions, please do type them into the chat box and we will answer them as we go along. Thank you very much, and over to you, Ben.
Great, thanks so much for having me. Do I need to click on anything to shift the screen over to me? Anyhow, I think, I'm really excited to talk about this project for many reasons. One of which is that this is still at the very early stages. And so, I'm excited to have a conversation with you all about what we're doing and what we're hoping to do over the next 3 years. Let me pull up my presentation. Great. So I thought I would present sort of a basic overview of a little bit about the background of the project to start, and then I'll summarize some of the findings from our first report, which was published in December, and then talk very briefly at the end about some of our next steps with the project. If you know anything about trust in news, of course, you know that it has been declining all around the world. So this is these figures are from the most recent digital news report, roughly 38% on average across all the different markets in the report say that they can trust most news most of the time. Those numbers are a little bit higher if you ask people about the news that they use themselves personally. But you'll notice here that across the board, trust has been declining year over year. There is, of course, some variation across countries. You'll see all the way over on the right, the UK and the US are sort of on that end of the spectrum. The UK has had double-digit declines in trusted news. On the other side, countries in Scandinavia, Brazil, there's more than half still say they trust most news most of the time. And of course, part of what we know is going on here are aspects of the political environment affecting the way that people are evaluating news media. So in the UK, for example, there's been a lot of the decline has been on the left, where you have much higher rates, relatively higher rates, although you still see a decline there on the right as well. And of course, some of this corresponds to political events like Brexit and divisive elections. Similarly, in the US, you have this growing story of polarization around trust in news. But here, of course, it's the right that is most distrustful of news, whereas you had actually some increase in trust on the left during the Trump years. We'll see what happens over the next 4 years. So when it comes to these sort of larger questions about what's driving declines in trust, we already know, of course, that politics and institutions matter quite a bit. And so that's sort of baked into our project. We sort of are very much aware of that. The other major factor that is at play here, of course, is the changing media environment. We know over the years, over the last decade or so, there's been some really dramatic changes in the way that people get information, the way that they engage with news media, increasingly through digital intermediaries, digital platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp, and increasingly more and more people, that's the way that in which they're actually consuming news. And so when we're asking people about their trust in news organizations, it's often sort of filtered through that lens. That's the way that people are actually consuming their information. So that's the second major thing that we're really thinking through. And then the third thing that we think may be at play here is the sort of broader cultural factors that may come into how people, the sort of stories and narratives people have in their mind about the way that the news works, the way that the media systems operate, the way that politics works. That may be the other thing that's really driving this. And notice, of course, none of these actually have a whole lot to do with the practice of journalism itself. And so that's one of the questions that we're thinking about, is sort of how, what news organizations themselves can do amidst all of these other forces that they're grappling with. So this is all background to the project itself. Last year, Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, director of the Reuters Institute, and Richard Fletcher, the senior research fellow, the head of the research team, they put together this grant proposal to the Facebook Journalism Project and got funding for this 3-year project to really delve deeply into the subject of trusted news and do so in a comparative way across countries, which is a really important aspect that's sort of been missing from a lot of the previous research. And I should say, as an aside, our research, our project is, although we're funded by Facebook, we're entirely independent from them. We're not reporting to them in any way. They're not sharing any data with us. So we're not dependent on them. We're completely 100% independent. And that's, of course, important to the work that we're doing. So in addition to these questions about what's driving declines in trust, we're also interested in trying to get a better handle on defining what trust is, as well as, I think this is a really important part, what can actually be done about it. We want to gather actionable evidence-based recommendations for news organizations amidst all of these different forces that are at play. So the project itself looks at 4 different countries: Brazil, India, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And these were selected to, as I said, ensure that we have this comparative piece of the project where we can look across different media environments, different political environments. And so you have variation across these four countries, which account for a significant proportion of the population of the world. As well as, we're spanning both the global north and the global south. And so we have variation in terms of the media literacy, the use of different forms of social media messaging apps, especially WhatsApp in India and Brazil. And, different levels of polarization, these are, large, complex systems in which you have a lot of different segments of the public maybe responding in different ways. So we have that comparative piece of the project, and then we have a multiple set of methods that we're employing. So I mentioned before, we really wanted to go in depth with the subject, which is why we limited the project to 4 countries and not 40 countries, which allows us to do some qualitative data collection. So talking to people in-depth interviews, focus groups, in more depth and more open-ended ways, as well as some more traditional survey-based research, which I'll get to a little bit later in the presentation as far as our next steps go, as well as some other things I'll talk a little bit more about at the end. So our first report, which was published last month, was, although most of the project is really going to be focused on the news media audiences in each of the 4 countries I talked about, we wanted to take a step back as we were starting to work on this and think through both, what has previously been studied on this subject, because the study of trusted news is pretty broad, and there's a significant amount of work that's already been done on the subject, much of it focused on the US and other Western democracies. But also we wanted to engage with journalists themselves. It was really important for our project that we are engaging with the kinds of questions that journalists, practitioners, senior managers in newsrooms, that they're thinking about when it comes to this question of trust in news. We didn't want this to just be sort of an abstract exercise, but we really hope to come up with some recommendations that could really be used So for this first report, we spent a lot of time interviewing journalists, as well as I said, senior managers at many of the sort of most widely used brands in each of the countries, as well as some of the most trusted, as well as some of the least trusted in some of the countries, based on the Reuters Institute digital news report data that we had, and synthesizing a lot of the previous research. So we did a really extensive literature review, went through about 200 articles, published articles, peer-reviewed in peer-reviewed journals, and tried to sort of make sense of this really messy literature, to try to organize it in a way that could help us moving forward with the project. So this report, which we published in December, and you can see the other co-authors listed here, Sumitra, Camilla, and Amy are all research fellows at the Institute working on the Trusted News Project, as well as Richard and Rasmus, who I previously mentioned. And I do encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to read it, I'm going to try to summarize our key points, but we tried to write it in a pretty accessible way. It's not super long, and we'll go in a little bit more depth than I'm able to in this presentation. But I will try to summarize the key points for you before we move on to questions. And we tried to organize it basically around 4 major points of things that we think we know already from both from the literature and from talking to the journalists that we talked to, as well as 4 key questions that we have. That's what we want to know part of the report. As far as the 4 major points of things that we already know, the first one is kind of seems relatively straightforward, and you may already be thinking about it, but I think it's a really important point worth emphasizing, which is if we want to define trusted news, we have to really specify what we mean by trust, by whose trust, and by what news. And this is another way of saying basically that survey question wording really matters. Most of the research that's previously been done on trusted news has basically been relying on these long-running longitudinal surveys. That's how we think we know that trust has been declining in a lot of places. But often those questions are worded in very broad, abstract ways. So I already showed you the questions that are used in the digital news report. And I showed you those 2 there, where you ask people about trust in news overall, whether I can trust most of the news most of the time, and the different responses you get when you ask people about trust in news that they themselves use. And generally, of course, people are more trusting of the news that they themselves use. And in places like the US and the UK, it's a pretty significant difference. Although you'll still see a majority of people who do not trust the news, even the news that they themselves use. We don't have data from India, so that's why that's excluded from this part. But beyond just that kind of basic distinction, there was an article published last year that really made the point that it's important to keep in mind these sort of different levels in the media when you're asking about trust in news, and different studies have looked at different aspects of this. So you can ask about trust in the news media in general, but you can delve into trust in individual brands of the news, individual journalists, trust in particular items of news content, and that people may have a mix of different attitudes about these different things. Trusted news isn't just about that one measure. And I think it's an important point to keep in mind as we have this conversation about what we're really talking about here. Because people may have very low trust of news in general, but when it comes to individual working journalists, they may have much more complicated views. There's another paper from a few years ago that was published that also made the point that when it comes to the sort of general trust in news, part of what may be going on is that as the media environment has changed, the kind of reference category people have in their minds is also been changing. So when you look at that time series of trust declining, part of what may explain it is that 30 years ago in the US, when you ask people about whether they trusted news in a general way, they were thinking about the evening news broadcasts on the major TV networks. But when you ask them about trust in news generally today, they may have other things in mind. They may be thinking about cable news. They may be thinking about Facebook. And so that sort of general question of news, that there's a different reference category involved. And that may be part of what's going on, even if, if you ask people specifically about the same form of news, and they did some experiments where they actually looked at that, the declines are not nearly as severe. The other thing that really came through to us in our conversations with journalists was that these kinds of methods of assessing trust that are often about kind of cognitive assessments of information credibility. Do I believe this news reporting? Is it trustworthy? Is it credible? That's only part of the story. A lot of the journalists we talked to in newsrooms, some of the other people working on trusted news, really emphasize the affective aspect of trust, so the way that people feel about the news brands, which may not be cognitive at all, may not be rational. It's just a set of emotions that people associate with a particular brand or news media generally. This relational aspect to trust, so it's not just trying to change people's attitudes about trust really involve changing that relationship with your news audience. It's not a kind of single shot thing. It is this ongoing relational dynamic. And then lastly, the importance of familiarity, and that ties into both of those points. That often the most familiar brands to people by virtue of the fact that they grew up with that brand, by they have this childhood association with it, or they've just sort of gotten accustomed to seeing it all the time, that plays a role as well in how people feel about the brand and that relationship that's formed over time. And so we think those are important pieces of what's going on here that often haven't been emphasized in the previous research. All right, so the second point, in addition to the first one about definitions, is just that we know that people don't really understand a whole lot about news gathering practices, journalism itself. And there's a quote from Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed, who I interviewed. The average person does not have a great grounding in how we do our work on the most basic level. And so when it comes to the things that news organizations can do to try to build trust with their audiences, it may be asking a whole lot of your average member of the news audience to make those evaluations about brands on the basis of the practices involved in the journalism itself. People don't really know what goes into it. How can you really expect them to differentiate and compare across news brands on that basis? And there's a lot of previous research that really has emphasized this in the past, that people don't generally know the difference between what is an op-ed versus news reporting about what why anonymous sources are used. There's just a lot that the public really doesn't understand about how journalism works, and that it may not be reasonable to expect your average person to engage that deeply with these kinds of nuts and bolt issues. The third thing that we want to emphasize in terms of what we do know is that there are some chronic problems in the way that the news media has covered certain communities, and that is also a factor at play here. So there's an example from a quote from the editor of The Caravan in India. If you ask a poor man on the street, someone who is historically deprived, whether there's media news content which is of relevance to their life in the way that they are on any of the social and political issues, the answer would probably be no. Why should they trust the media? And this was something that got emphasized quite often, especially in the US and the UK, where there was a lot of talk about reckoning with some of the past failures of news organizations themselves, or news generally, in the way that they've ignored or stigmatized particular communities in their own lack of diversity within their own ranks, and some of these problems in coverage itself. And this is a topic that came up quite frequently. We talked to a couple of people from the nonprofit news organization Mississippi Today, based in the US, about some of the efforts that they've taken towards engage journalism is the academic term for more and more news organizations are sort of moving in its direction where they're trying to develop a more deeper relationship with their audience through different forms of engaged journalism practices. So Mississippi Today, for instance, has these public newsrooms. They talked about some of the things they've done, like source audits in the past, where they try to look at the representation within the people that they're generally speaking to as sources, and some of the other practices they're involved in, and other news organizations as well talked about some of these kinds of initiatives. Of course, one of the challenges with kind of staking out, your news organization's values around deciding to focus on one audience versus another audience, or one segment of the public versus another segment of the public, which Mississippi Today has been very intentional about that. So it leaves you open to criticism about being biased in some way, and they have faced accusations of being partisan or being unfair for choosing to focus their coverage in this way. They've been accused of race baiting by focusing on the Black community in the Mississippi Delta. And this was something that really across all 4 countries, there's been some discussion about how to kind of walk this line between choosing to focus on covering communities in deeper and more meaningful ways than has maybe been done in the past. At the same time, how partisan the climate is. And so there is a recognition that many countries and many news organizations, that there may not be ideological diversity within newsrooms. And so there's this sort of constant fear of being accused of being, not being impartial, not being neutral politically. And that brings us to the last major point of what we think we know, which is, I alluded to at the beginning, which is that we know that assessments of trust and distrust are so deeply intertwined with politics and the political environment. And there's been, quite a bit of research that shows this in different ways, both in terms of, evaluations of different institutions. We also know as the media environment has changed, people are, they have more media choices available to them. There's more people who are particularly interested in politics are gravitating towards more and more news content that aligns with their views. People who are less interested in politics sort of, they choose entertainment options, and so they can kind of fall out of the broader conversation about politics and news. And of course, you have political leaders who are intervening in this discourse, who are doing their own part to sow confusion and doubt about news organizations and the news media generally. And so these political dynamics are sort of inescapable and are often looming in the background when it comes to trying to address some of these issues of trust in news. All right, so those are the 4 big things that we think we know. What do we want to know? So these are our 4 big key questions for the project going forward. First of them is, to what extent are the platforms themselves playing a role in these dynamics? Are they damaging news organizations' brand identities? And this was something that often came up in conversations with journalists and other practitioners. We heard people talk about this feeling of being kind of held captive to platforms, both when it comes to their business strategies, but also trying to create deeper relationships with the readers who may be only really encountering their content in their news feeds very fleetingly. So trying to put a lot of emphasis on what differentiates you from competitors can be really challenging in that kind of an environment. So this is something that a number of people pointed to. This is a quote from a television reporter I interviewed in Oklahoma, who was very conscious of the fact that it's hard to get people to differentiate between all the different sources of media on the platforms. We did hear some examples of people talking about ways in which the platforms can be opportunities to kind of build more in-depth relationships with some segments of their audiences, and using their comment sections, using their groups to really both cultivate sources and engage in a more meaningful way, talk to people one-on-one in a way that would be hard to do in a traditional newsroom. But more often, there were these concerns about competing with all the other sources of information in people's news feeds who are not playing by the same rules, who don't have the same sort of professional practices around verification, around correcting misinformation, et cetera. Which isn't to say that that not all news organizations themselves are deserving of trust. There are plenty of news organizations in all 4 countries that are part of the problem here. But this does create some of these challenges. It's a quote from an editor at a newspaper in Brazil, talking about the fact that people don't follow media organizations that often anymore. They really follow other people on social media platforms like Facebook, and so the news organization itself is up against a random guy who's in his looking at the world through his bedroom window, who isn't necessarily taking the time to confirm and report information like a professional news organization. And the audience doesn't necessarily differentiate between the two. So that's the first question. Second question is, I alluded to earlier some of these really intriguing, important innovations around engaging with audiences in new ways. The problem is most of this work is being done by intuition. We just don't really actually know what actually works, what might be, what might not work, what might be causing, the trade-offs involved in trying to reach certain audiences in some ways. And some of this comes down to scalability of these things. Everything comes at a cost. And so there's a trade-off between choosing to do this initiative versus another. Some of it comes down to what audiences you might alienate by engaging in certain strategies. But all of these things we just don't have a lot of data about what's worth doing and what's not, what may feel good or sound good, but may in the end not make the kind of differences that are really needed. So I'll give you just some background as well from the Digital News Report. There was a question in the report about different kinds of news available to them, whether people prefer to get news that shares their point of view, that has no point of view at all, or that challenges your point of view. And in different media environments, people, in general, people say that they prefer news with no point of view. What people really mean by that is a separate question, but quite a significant portion of audiences say that they actually prefer news with that shares their point of view specifically. And so it's not obvious to news organizations exactly how you're not going to be able to please all your audiences all the time. And so you have to be sort of deliberate and intentional about who you're trying to reach in what way. And that needs to be part of the conversation about what strategies to employ. Third thing that is a big question for us is about transparency. And this also often came up in our conversations with journalists. A lot of attention to questions about how transparent to be and sort of what the public really wants of news organizations. So there's a quote from media editor at The Guardian who said, if you believe what the public says that they want, we'd all just be reading news in the form of monthly magazine filled with 4,000 word articles. And so, that's one of the reasons why we think it's important to have a mixed methods approach in this work, because we want to be able to delve more deeply beyond what people just say in a poll about what they think, what their expectations are about news itself. But the other thing is, there's a lot of emphasis on the importance of journalists and newsrooms in coming across as sort of genuine human beings who are authentic, who are three-dimensional. There are efforts like podcasts at the New York Times. This is a quote from a podcast producer who talked about how important it is for the audio initiatives to really show the humanity of the journalists involved, show the humanity of what they're reporting on as well. But you get to know the kind of the people who are making the news, making these decisions in a much more nuanced way than just as a sort of faceless name and a byline. And this is something, especially talking to folks who work in radio and television, is always on their mind, about the way that they're coming across as individuals, as real people. But it's not and so we think that there's probably something there in terms of building trust with audiences. At the same time, it's also been pointed out that people are often more trusting of the brand itself, and there may be value to not personalizing the news in this way in some cases, and maybe that this is true of certain audiences, but not other audiences. And so this is one of these things where there may also be trade-offs involved when it comes to transparency. And how you reach and engage with audiences in a meaningful way.
And I'm going to just say 2 more minutes, and then there are questions as well, which I'd love to get to. Thank you.
I'm almost done. So the last question that we pose in the report has to do with kind of broad preconceptions people have about where news comes from and how they can be changed. And some of this is kind of rooted in academic research that I've worked on, and others around what were called folk theories, or the way that people think about the sort of broad narratives about the way that the news works and where that comes from. Some of that comes from the broader entertainment media environment, these ideas that people have about the way journalism works, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And so we think that this is potentially also at play when it comes to the sort of big picture views that people may have about what's going on in the news business. So those are the big questions for the project. I'll just say briefly what our next steps are. So we're right now in the process of putting together the next stage of the research, which will be qualitative. We are going to do some focus groups as well as in-depth interviews with individuals in each of the 4 countries over the next couple months. Later this year, we plan to collect some survey data, building on some of the insights that we learned from having those qualitative conversations. And then in the coming years, we hope to do more sort of follow-up versions of both of those initiatives, as well as other things like experiments, potentially partnering with news organizations, track studies of people's web browsing habits, et cetera, to hopefully get us to a place where we can make some more concrete recommendations about what we think there's empirical evidence to suggest, maybe productive strategies for moving forward for news organizations. So I will leave it there and stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you very much. Brilliant presentation and a really good, I do encourage everybody to read the report. It's brilliant New Year's reading and the start of a kind of, it frames the questions and poses the questions that we should all be thinking as journalists. Do type your questions into the Q&A box, especially the new journalist fellows at the Reuters Institute who are all quarantining in their rooms and should be in the seminar room. Sorry you can't be here in person, but do please type in your questions as well as everybody else. I'm going to start with one of them, Tor, from Norway, who's asking, why do you think the Nordic media always score so high on trust? It's always the joke, things are always better in Finland or Norway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated, I don't have a good answer for you. I think you do see some of these cultural differences that may be rooted in, some of these broader cultural narratives, folk theories, a sense of sort of why it's important to follow the news and sort of valuing it at a broader cultural level. I think there's also, there are differences in the media environments in these countries and places where there's been, there is academic work that shows that places that have stronger public service broadcasting, it tends to have more in-depth public affairs, civic affairs coverage than places that are much more dominated by commercial media. And so that may also be playing a role in terms of what people are even evaluating is actually, different and distinct. And so that may be part of it. There are these sort of persistent cross-country trends that exist over time, and that is one of the reasons why we think it's important to have this comparative focus of the project.
Thank you. And that goes nice to the next question with Peter Adeli. Hi, Peter, from Hungary, which has a very, very, very different media environment. And certainly the last years has seen a kind of precipitous fall in the kind of the independence of its journalism. And it's asking, during the last round of data gathering, did you find any country or region where trust in media grew, or is there a global decline? And did you look at trust in specific news organizations like the New York Times or the Guardian? I can partly answer the second one because it's from the Digital News Report. And if you have, what did you find there?
Yeah, right. So the second part is easier to say because the digital news report does specifically ask about brand level trust, so yeah, there are pretty clear differences in terms of, for example, in the U.S. Attitudes towards the New York Times versus BuzzFeed and Huffington Post or etc. Um, in terms of countries where trusted news has increased, there's nothing coming to mind, but I have to admit my focus with our project has been so narrowly focused on the 4 countries that are part of our purview that I haven't spent as much time looking more broadly at the data that we have. One of the challenges with evaluating trust over time is that you need to have been asking about it in a consistent way over a significant period of time. And so there aren't a lot of sources of data to really actually evaluate that. The digital news report is unique in that respect, but it's, the number of countries has been increasing basically every year, but it also really only goes back a handful of years. And so we don't have a great way of assessing that in a comparative cross-country way over a significant amount of time.
Thank you. And there's a few questions on the selection of the countries in this project. And it'd be just useful if you kind of talk a little bit about why these 4 countries were selected, because someone is asking why not the Middle East, for example, and there's a kind of sense of, yeah, how do you plan to expand the number of countries? How were they selected? What's the reason behind it?
So, we'd love to eventually be able to expand the number of countries for the 3 years that this grant is in effect for when we're working on this project as it exists right now. We're very deliberate about narrowing our focus so that we could do this. I mean, that's the trade-off. The more countries you expand, the more complicated, the more expensive, the more complex the project becomes. And so there's a kind of practical logistical aspect to why just these 4. And you'll notice, of course, 3 of the 4, English is widely spoken, which makes it easier for us to work as a team together on. The other, so that's one constraint. And then, I think in general, when you're dealing with comparative research, you're trying to strike this balance between similarity and difference. You want variation across the countries, but you don't want so much variation that it's just too hard to make comparisons across one to the other. And so I think that was the other factor at play in terms of why these are very different countries, but there are some similarities in terms of the big challenges that are facing media audiences in all 4 places when it comes to things like concerns about misinformation, about use of WhatsApp, and some of the platforms themselves that are used across all 4. And so I think that may have been another factor. I should say too, the decision to focus on these 4 was prior to my joining the project. So I can't speak as in depth about exactly why these 4, sort of channeling what Richard and Rasmus had in mind. But I see the logic to why these 4 were selected for the reasons I talked about in the presentation. And I think, I think there's a lot of interest in potentially expanding as the project progresses and potentially looking at other places as well, once we have the sort of base that we're hoping to build.
Thank you. A question from Mark Olu from Kenya. Hi, Mark. It's a great effort. It's a really good start, but it's asking about would you agree that the media ownership plays a huge role in trust? There are audiences that trust or distrust the media houses entirely because of their views on who owns them. It's a very, very good point.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's, I think, one of the things that we will be trying to listen for in our conversations with audiences in all 4 countries is how much that is something that people are thinking about that they have on their mind when they are making these assessments. It's, I think that there are many of us who study journalism who pay a lot of attention to things like that, and people who work in journalism, certainly. It's not clear to me how much audiences are really engaging with it. Some may be extensively, some may be on the basis of kind of misunderstandings about ownership and how it plays a role in newsrooms. In other cases, they may be very right about what's going on. And so it's one of the things that I think is hard to generalize, especially across the 4 different countries here. but it's certainly something that we'll be looking at.
Thank you. And a question from Bermat Talent from the Ukraine. Hi. You mentioned at the beginning that the public understanding of journalistic work and news gathering is low. And are you planning to look into how unethical journalistic practices, basically bad journalism or poor standards, contribute to declining trust in media? This is like, we don't trust you because you're not particularly trustworthy.
Yeah, I mean, not directly as part of the project. And most of our focus will be going forward on audience perceptions of news organizations and their sense of what goes on and their ideas about some of these practices. But there certainly is, this certainly did come up in our conversations with journalists and practitioners that there is this challenge. Often when we talk about trusted news, we talk about it in this abstract, general way across the entire media environment. But in truth, there are major differences across news organizations operating within the same country and across countries, of course, in terms of those journalistic practices. And there are many, many news organizations that are not deserving of trust. And so that's a complicated piece of this, that there's kind of a collective problem around building trust, but you want to build trust that's deserving based on practices that are not corrupt, that are sort of rooted in professionalism and independence and the things that we generally think that audiences value about news. And so, it's definitely going to be part of the conversations that we're going to be having with individuals in each of the 4 countries. Even if we're not going to be making value judgments ourselves about, what goes on in one region versus another.
Yeah, it's kind of an ongoing problem with trusted news initiatives, like who decides and whose standards are being applied. Shirish, hi. A question asking you to look forward a bit, because this isn't in your data, I know, but it's a very good question. The next age of journalism is likely to be driven by AI, machine learning, natural language generation. Do you have a view on whether this is going to have a positive or negative impact on trust, or no difference?
That's a really interesting question. I don't have a view. It isn't something that came up at all in our conversations with individuals in newsrooms. But I suspect you may be right that in a number of years that might be different. That may be something that comes up more often. I think that, and I don't have, my sense is that audiences don't have a whole lot of ideas about that sort of thing. But it's something that we'll be paying attention to. I do know, the one area where it has come up is around the algorithms that social media companies use. And there's some work that shows that audiences are often more trusting of those algorithms than they are of individuals making decisions about what's newsworthy and gatekeeping and these kinds of things. And so it wouldn't surprise me if if there's more openness to it among audiences than there is among professionals in newsrooms, because there is this lack of trust often at play in terms of who's making the decisions about what to report on and what to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, this goes nicely to the question from Malva Izquierdo from Nicaragua, which is about social media and this kind of complex, interplay between social media and news, and what are people trusting? So do you think social media determines how much some people trust news companies, given that the social media is providing more news to many people than the news organizations themselves?
Yeah, it comes up in a number of different ways. One way is, I talked a little bit in the presentation about transparency, and this is something a lot of newsrooms are grappling with, is how much, on the one hand, you want your journalists to cultivate audiences on social media because it's important to sort of build those relationships and convince people to subscribe, become members. And so there's a lot of emphasis on that kind of thing. One of the television journalists we talked to talked about how she's actually required by her company to post multiple times a day on her Facebook page for herself, even if it's just about what she had for lunch. And this is sort of about that humanizing the people behind the news aspect of what goes on. On the other hand, does that actually build trust? We don't actually really know the answer to that. And so that's one piece of it. I think the other part of it is this question about what people really get to know about your company or your brand or the journalistic practices you have, if all they're ever seeing is, you sort of fleetingly appear in their newsfeed amidst 400 other things. And that's something that a lot of people we talk to said is a real challenge, that this is part of feeling sort of held captive by the platforms themselves.
And can we stay on that topic, because it's quite an important one, given there are so many journalists in the room and they feel this quite cleanly. And a question from Louis Toledo, again from Brazil, and one of our journalist fellows. And David Friedlander in your research has said that people trust other people more than the institutions, and therefore is it logical for journalistic organizations to promote their own journalists to build up this trust? So mention their profiles, their social media profiles, their image, really make them superstar journalists.
Yeah, and I think, my suspicion is that this is the kind of thing that there's not a single answer to. That for some members of your audiences, they are really looking for that kind of deeper relationship with specific journalists. They really want to know who's behind making the decisions. And so podcasts like The Daily at the New York Times, they feature the work that goes into the journalism. They get to know sort of the people behind those bylines in a way that I think is really valuable for building trust with audiences. But that's a specific niche audience who's going to be interested in that sort of thing. And so I think there's a lot of variation here, and I think it depends on the segments of the public you're trying to reach and the kind of relationship that they're looking for with your brand. And of course, the more people get to know those individuals, the more ammunition that people who are critics are going to have about the subjectivity of the people who are making those gatekeeping and news gathering decisions. And so there are risks involved in sort of the more information, the more transparent you are about those practices and processes.
Thank you. And you wrote this report incredibly quickly for a start, but also in the middle of a pandemic. And we've done a lot of report at the Reuters Institute on on news behavior, audience behaviors around the pandemic. And a question from Marilia Gerke, who I think is in Brazil. Is this an opportunity? Is the media coverage around COVID-19 an opportunity to rebuild trust? Is there an opportunity to focus on local or regional journalism in particular? Because in Brazil, the pandemic is evolving differently depending on which city and state you're in, and people still need verified information for their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, this came up in some of the interviews. Actually, particularly in Brazil, there were several people who really saw COVID-19 as an opportunity for news organizations to really demonstrate how valuable they are for the difference between what they're doing versus misinformation, disinformation on social media. And I think there's some truth to that. I think it's too early to know for certain whether there will be any kind of enduring changes in people's attitudes towards news as a result of this pandemic. But I think it runs the risk of that may be true to an extent, but you also have this highly polarized political environment. I'm thinking, especially in the US, where everything about COVID has become so partisan and polarized. It's just been part of this broader amount of polarization towards news generally. And so there's a significant segment of the public who don't see journalists and news media as being valuable in this crisis. They actually just see it as more reason to be distrustful because they're convinced that COVID is some sort of conspiracy. So I think it cuts both ways.
Yeah, I mean, sticking with the point of polarization, the question from Ipsita Chakravarti in India is: does the higher political polarization feed into lower trust in news, or is it to do with people preferring to read news that echoes their point of view? Do you see that? Again, I was going to ask that question: how much is it trust about genuine trust, and how much is it about just agreeing with what you're reading or seeing?
Yeah, and I don't think we quite know yet. I think these things are really hard to disentangle. And when it comes to India, we know we just don't have very much data at all, which is one of the things that I'm really excited about with this project, is that we're going to be able to gather more data and empirical evidence about what's going on and compare it across to other countries in this kind of systematic way. But I think that there's no question that they're intertwined. And I don't know if we'll be able to fully disentangle it, but it's probably a kind of feedback loop to an extent, where you have both kind of selective exposure to like-minded sources that are feeding distrust of everything else, and that's contributing to these kind of demand for this kind of news. And you have, politicians who are happy to intervene in those processes and try to convince their supporters to trust a source of information versus something else. And so, I think it's definitely part of the story about what's going on. But we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about it. I'll say that.
Yeah. Thank you. A question from Renata Schroeder, hi, which is about regulation. And this is possibly something for one of the future projects, but are you looking at the impact of self-regulation and its potential impact or actual impact on trust?
Potentially it came up here and there with some of our conversations with both the journalists and other practitioners who are working in the space of trusted news. There's always some questions about policy, and it may be that sort of we're led in that direction based on our research. It's probably too soon for us to know for sure whether that's the direction we'll go. It's really going to be, there's a really strong inductive aspect to this project where we're trying to be open to being led by what we learned from the conversations we're planning to have with news audiences in a more in-depth way. And I think that's something that's been missing from a lot of the trusted news research, which has often been survey-based and sort of you go in trying to sort of test hypotheses about what's going on. And this is such a complex phenomenon that we really wanted to take this sort of more open inductive approach. But it's certainly something we'll be looking at.
Thank you very much. And then I think we're going to run out of time quite soon, but I just want to ask a few questions. There's quite a few questions coming out of India and Pakistan. And the decline in trust in media year on year, especially in India. Rachel Chitra, again from India, is asking about Modi equaling, Modi equals Trump in the way he's kind of called out journalists, coined the term prostitutes, discrediting journalistic work. Rachel is saying, it looks like the country's turning fascist in many ways in this. And what are the kind of circumstances of this kind of decline in this kind of narrative? Do you see something similar in Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously one of the factors that has sort of driven interest in the subject is this concern about political leaders using and exploiting the public's lack of trust in news to their advantage. And certainly there's a part of the report, it ended up being very brief, but then it was part of our conversations with a lot of journalists was trying to get their sense of why trust in news matters. It's not just something that a bunch of academics are interested in sort of the abstract sense, but why it matters for the work that they do. And it matters in terms of getting sources to talk to you and getting politicians to be accountable for the reporting that gets done. So the sort of fundamental idea of watchdog journalism, if the public doesn't actually trust what you put out, it's easy for those politicians to ignore it and not be held accountable. So there are real impacts associated with this declining trust, which is of course one of the reasons why politicians are often so keen to disparage the press, because it works to their advantage. And there is some research that shows, places where there is less journalism, that there's higher rates of corruption. And so, these things really do matter, and it's certainly part of the motivation for the project. But these are all countries that are very, this is true of all countries, but some of these are very large countries. In India, you have many different languages being spoken, as you all know. Like, it's hard to generalize at a country level because there are such distinct differences going on among different segments of the public, and that's one of the reasons why we need more data about what's actually going on, because we just don't currently have great information about how different segments of the public are responding in these ways.
Thank you. And talking about different segments of the public, and there's a question here about different segments of the media, which is, do you think that there is a difference in the way columnists are viewed and trusted compared to the news? So can you have one brand, the New York Times being the obvious example, where trust in news is very different from trust in podcasts, which is very different from trust in columnists, and how does that affect trust overall?
Yeah, and it's you know, there are different kind of journalistic norms from country to country in terms of how much news organizations tend to distinguish between opinion and news reporting. And of course, that's also something that in the social media environment, some of those distinctions that existed in the past, where it was very clear in a newspaper, these people were on a different section of the paper, that's no longer obvious online. And so, you know, I think I think that is something that feeds into what's going on. My suspicion is that much of the public doesn't necessarily distinguish between who's a columnist and who's a reporter. But that is something that we'll be looking at is what basis are people actually making these different assessments about news.
Yeah, thank you. And my final question, because this is kind of looking forward into kind of like what can be done, which is from Tanya Meyerhofer, which is you mentioned there's a link between politics and trust in the news, and this is an ongoing theme. And how much do you think is the strength of the public media system, or kind of having a well-funded public media system contributes, combined with accessibility to good education? So can we boost trust in news with those two factors?
There's a school of thought that it's really important, and that this is an extremely valuable and important strategy. There are others who think, you know, there's been maybe too much emphasis on it, that it happens to correlate with a bunch of other things. Places that have, you know, significant investments in public service media are also, you know, wealthy democracies where there's a whole other set of cultural values at play. And so it's really hard to disentangle those things. I don't think this is the kind of thing you sort of flip a switch and you just invest in public broadcasting and education and everything is fine. You have lots of public broadcasters that are you know, aligned politically with you know, that are not neutral, that are not independent, that are not evaluated as trustworthy for that reason, because it is intertwined with the political system. So it's complicated, which is sort of a general theme of this presentation. But you know, that is one of the reasons why we wanted to look at this in a comparative way across countries, where you have, you know, a country like the UK where there is the BBC is so dominant in the media environment, versus a place like the US where there's very little public broadcasting, public media, and is less a part of the conversation. So that's my my attempt to answer that question, because I don't really know the answer to it.
Absolutely. Well, it's a good note to end on, because it is, and this is the first report of many on this incredibly complicated issue. Thanks so much, Ben, for your time and for your expertise. And thank you everybody for joining in on this kind of January afternoon. It's been a fantastic conversation to start the year. A kind of very tumultuous few months lie ahead of us. And so wishing everybody, you know, stay safe and healthy. Next week, we have Elite Truong, who's Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Washington Post, talking about innovation in one of the most innovative companies at the world. So do join in. Registration details will be on our social media channels and our website. And in the meantime, thank you all very much. And thank you, Ben.
Thank you.